ancients understood that Saturn had rings. They knew many mysteries pertaining to the heavens. The Jews, of course, are the most clearly obvious Saturnian cult, but there are many others. They're part stellar because you have the 7 candelabra, the 7 days of the week. But in a modern context, which is one of the most interesting things to study, we find that the colors of the police uniforms and the judges and the robes and rituals involved in courts, the priests, as I said, with their black robes and white collars, the monks with their shaved heads and robes, and teachers even. The teachers coming out in their black robes, representing Saturn. Everyone in astrology knows that Saturn rules order and discipline and studiousness and patience and matriculation. But the fact that they're dressed also in black and have the square head gear is all coming out of a particular cult, very ancient. We also, like we have a cult of Venus and a cult of Dionysus operating in the world, we also have a priesthood of Saturn operating in the world. And they also can be getting up to no good. Kronos is the other name for Saturn. And from the word Kronos we get chronology, which represents time. Crowns. The idea of a king wearing a crown was that he was a regent under Kronos. He was an agent on earth of Kronos. He turned the rays of the sun inwards, as Jordan Maxwell has pointed out. The rays of the sun turn inwards, make a crown, a coronet. Krona, coronet, corona, cron, Karen, they all come from a word. Each of these deities has many symbols attached to it. Now, in a modern context, we find that these strange assassination type happenings and other bizarrities happening on earth, like we went into in Weapons of Mass Deception behind the New World Order, the importance of ritual, satanic ritual that politicians and secret societies are involving themselves in. One stock example that involved the symbolism associated with Saturn was the Heaven's Gate. Remember earlier we were talking about the Heaven's Gates, literally the northern gate of birth and the southern gate of death. Well, that's what these people were referring to. The death gate is Saturn, Capricorn. And sure enough, in that particular ritual, Applegate or Applewhite and his mad cult, we discover many Saturnian symbols. Not only were these people castrated, but you only have to open a book on Greek mythology to find out that Kronos castrated his father. And the sickle is a very, very important hallmark of Saturn worship. We not only find that they dressed all in black, black is the symbol of Saturn. The Nike logo, they all wore Nike gear and Nike shoes. Well, the Nike logo is a subliminal symbol for Saturn. If you look at the logo for Nike, you'll find that it's the edge of the ring of Saturn. But the very name, Heaven's Gate, is enough to put us on to what's really going on here. This is a massive ritual to some ancient deities. Now concerning the lunar cult, Pickett and Prince in their book Templar Revelation say that in the Synoptic Gospels the woman who anoints Jesus is not named, although they make a point that she is a sinner. Mary of Bethany, who did the anointing, was known by the rabbis as Mary Lucifer, Mary the light bringer. So right there we've got a dichotomy. Yes, we know from the stories and the movies and whatnot and from Sunday school and everything else that this sinner, all the disciples hated her guts and didn't know why Jesus was hanging around with her. But then we have in the rabbi tradition, oh no, she's Lucifer, the lady light bringer. And then we do, even in the Bible, have her mysteriously initiating or anointing Jesus. So which is true? What is going on here? Well, what's going on here is revealed when we analyze the word sinner. Those who have looked at my astrotheology page on the website, who've checked into this, know that the word sinner doesn't mean anything negative at all. In this program we've been talking about how one cult supplanted the others, and one cult becomes the hegemony over another. Well, in that process, the previous cult, together with all of its customs, its traditions, and its belief systems, are considered or thought to be negative. All right? They're demonized by the next cult that comes into power or into ascendancy. The word sinner comes from the word Sin, S-I-N, which was the earliest known name of the moon goddess. She was known as Min, and he was also in Babylon known as a male Sin, S-I-N. So when you hear the prophets of old, and we hear them remonstrating and saying, get thee hence, go and sin no more, get this woman away, she's a sinner. It does not have anything to it doesn't have anything to do with moral or karmic rectitude or imperfection. It simply means this is a female of the lunar cult. So when you hear them say, go and sin no more, all they're saying is, go and sin no more, don't go and worship sin anymore. Worship the sun, that's all holy, but don't be worshiping the moon. And if you do, you're a sinner. So Eric Newman, the German scholar, says that a favored symbol of the matriarchal sphere is the moon in its relationship to the night and to the Great Mother, or the night sky, an expression of her essential spirit. As I said earlier, the lunar cult was symbolized by the scarabus beetle of Egypt and the unicorn, the white pale unicorn of the moon and the northerly sign of Cancer. The scarabus beetle motif comes from Khepra, the Egyptian god of the scarabus beetle, whose sign was when the sun passes to its highest point through Cancer up into Leo, its royal house. Khepra, the god of Egypt. All the lunar cult were distinguished because they'd wear the horns, the lunar horns. Same as the Native American Indians who count time by the many moons. Well, their shaman would wear the lunar horns. And we see Michelangelo, Moses, who, by the way, was the leader in ancient times of the lunar cult, is seen in the sculpture with the lunar horns. It's always perplexed art historians and the Christians. Why is Moses seen with the horns? What could it possibly mean? It means what Michelangelo, being a member of secret societies, understood. And that is that he is the king or the leader of the lunar cult. And he worshipped on Mount Sinai. Sinai was the mountain on which you worship the moon. And this, because, of course, you have to go high on the mountain to have your observatories and your shrines when you worship the constellations in the heavens. That's why mountains and hills were considered sacred. Moses means from the water. That's all it means. The priestess draws Moses from the water. Now, Moses or Moses also meant the initiator, the one who initiated with water. On Islamic flags to this day, we'll see the crescent moon. And even though as patriarchal and as fundamentalistic as they may be, their symbols show you where they originally came from. The star and the moon that's on their turrets and their minarets and on their symbols and their flags show you that they originated, like Christianity, from the stellar and the lunar cult. The symbol we use today for money, the so-called dollar bill sign, is a very, very ancient motif coming out from 10,000 years and before, from the time of Egypt. The god, as I said, the color of money was the three colors of the sun, the moon, and the earth. But silver is more predominant than gold. So most of the coins of the world were silver, and most of the money and the coins of the world were dedicated to the moon, because moon is silver, moon is white. And if they're dedicated to the moon, they're obviously dedicated to the goddess of the moon. And the most famous goddess of the moon was Isis. And if you shrink her name to the name of Isis, I-S-I-S, if you compact those together, you will get the American dollar sign. Money, M-O-N-E-Y, Mon for the moon. The Virgin Mary is always described as having 12 stars in her hair, 12 stars around her head, crowned with 12 stars, and standing on the crescent moon. What could it possibly mean? The Statue of Liberty, the very symbol of America, is Egyptian, comes from Lady Semiramis, or also from Sechet, the Egyptian goddess. So the females of the lunar cult were once the keepers of the gnosis. They understood the mystery of the fauna and the flora, and they were the high initiators. Particularly coming down to us is the Holy Grail motif. The Holy Grail motif, which is picked up in the Christians with the Eucharist and the drinking of the wine, and here's the bread, which is my body, and the wine, which is my blood. But of course what we're not told is that bread is sacred to the female cult, because the four ingredients that come to make up bread, yeast, grain, water, and wheat, are all female earth symbols. And the blood of the red wine is very clearly the female menstrual blood. In the tarot we have the suit of cups, and the Ace of Cups, all representing this motif of the chalice as being connected to knowledge. But as time passed and these cults supplant each other, the lunar cult and its representatives become demonic. As the elucidation says, that and the kingdom became dead and desert, for they lost the voices of the wells and of the damsels that were therein. In Divination and the Goddess, we talk very much in that program, in this series, about how women were the keepers of being, where men were more about the keepers of doing, and how women have lost that, which is partly why the world is in the state that it's in. And that in order to even be able to work in society and operate today, the females have to lose their femininity, just as men have lost it, and become more masculinized, and the consequences of that for both the sexes and for the world. Now, as I said, the word mystery comes from the word for woman. It derives from mesta and also from mass, M-A-S. So when you hear about the Christians holding their mass, it's an entirely female rite and ritual coming out of Egypt, the mass. It also gives the mess, M-E-S-S, is an Egyptian word, as in the Catholic Mass. It originally was the circular wafer representing the ovum. So when you see the priest putting that little round white wafer into the believer's mouth, that represents the wafer which represents the female ovum. So that by you intaking it into your body, you will become feminized. He's already dressed in robes of a female, standing in Holy Mother Church with a chalice in one hand, offering you bread with the other. It's all a feminine matriarchal symbol coming from the lunar cult. The word secret comes from the word secretion, implying again the female mysteries, the biology of the female. When we are given a blessing, what we're not told is that comes from blodsen, which means in Teutonic, in Germanic, bleeding. Female again, feminine. Now the tears are oblique references to the divine menstruum. Okay, so the falling of tears of the Jew, and if you look at tarot card number 18, you'll see that the moon goddess is weeping tears. Isis, of course, wept tears for Osiris. Well, the tears are oblique references to the divine menstruum, called the Khu, K-H-U, by the Egyptians. It was the tears which Isis cried over her lost consort Osiris. In alchemical writings, this menstruum was known as the starfire or even the wise blood. It also is the sang grail of the Arthurian legends, carried by 3 maidens. In the Orthodox canon, it appears obliquely as the red wine of the Christian Eucharist. We hear in the Bible that Mary Magdalene is the harlot, but what we don't read is that again is a mistranslation. The word harlot comes originally from Herodolai, but Herodolai means the sacred or beloved one. Ah, is that a change? Harlot comes from Herodolai, meaning she is the sacred one, the beloved one, my beloved one. Now Mary Magdalene, Magdala in Aramaic means tower. Mary Magdalene is known as the Lady of the Tower. But who's the original Lady of the Tower? The original Lady of the Tower was Nephthys, the sister of Isis. If you look on any Egyptian papyri, you'll see Isis, the 2 females, the 2 mothers. Like I said earlier, that all those 2 Marys motifs comes from Isis and Nephthys, the twins. But you'll notice that Isis has her famous headdress, the seat, and beside her stands Nephthys, and her headdress was the tower. So thousands of years before, we have the story of Mary Magdalene, Lady of Magdala, the tower. It's an old re-scripting of Isis and also of Nephthys, the Lady of the Tower. Egyptian. The wedding feast at Cana is the wedding feast of the serpent, of the stellar cult. And at that point, we understand that's now coming to light through the release of the Gnostic Gospels and other deep researches that the marriage feast of Cana was the marriage of Jesus Christ to Mary Magdalene. And that's just as simple as that. The 2 were wed. These 2 individuals, it was covered up later, but the idea that even if they're biographical or they're fictional, the idea was that at Cana there was a coming together, a marriage. Now Leonard Shlain, in his book The Alphabet versus the Goddess, says that the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks and Romans had no word in their language for sin. The Israelites introduced both the word and the concept into the stream of Western civilization, and by so doing diverted it. one of the most important female goddess traditions, concepts, was Sophia, called the goddess of wisdom. The word Sophia means wisdom. And Caitlin Matthews lets us know how important Sophia was to the Christians. She says, "It was Rudolf Bultmann, was it not, the German biblical scholar who cited certain passages in the Gospels as interpolations of Sophia herself, put into the mouth of Christ." The most powerful cult that rules the world from the Grecian times onwards, and possibly even from the 18th dynasty of Egypt onwards, is the solar cult. This is the dominant power through all the ages of the modern, even though, of course, the solar cult has appropriated many of the symbols, as we've seen, of the lunar and the Saturnian and the stellar cult. The solar cult and the paradigm of thinking that goes with that is the one that is in prominence or is in ascendancy in the modern world. As Schwaller de Lubitsch wrote, the priesthood, and he means the priesthood of Saturn and the Sun, is always will be abusive. One of the main fallacies of Occidental religions is that which espouses that man begins as a sinner and gets to the light by means of conversion involving any number of physical intermediaries. In my book, Introduction to the Tarot's Major Arcana, I say that to the Gnostics and Sophists, this philosophy holds no currency. The Gnostics did not convert sinners, they awakened, they are ready. Erich Fromm, talking of the Old Testament, says, "The document that most powerfully exemplifies an extremely male patriarchal attitude is the Old Testament. It is not surprising that the subject of productiveness, the creation itself, also finds an extreme male solution in its pages. The reason why the Old Testament exhibits such a one-sided male character is that as the primary text of the Jewish monotheism, it represents a male victory over female deities, over the matriarchal remnants in the social structures. The Old Testament is the triumphal hymn of the victorious male religion, a song of victory commemorating the destruction of all traces of matriarchy in religion and society." Leonard Schlein says that about 1500 BC there were hundreds of goddess-based sects enveloping the Mediterranean basin. By the 5th century AD, they had almost been completely eradicated. By then, women were also prohibited from conducting a single major Western sacrament. The oldest temple of the Western world, the Pantheon, is actually dedicated to the female goddess. Lewis Mumford, historian and philosopher, a sociologist, says that out of the early Neolithic complex, a different kind of social organization arose, no longer democratic, that is based on neighborly intimacy, customary usage and consent, but authoritarian, centrally directed, under the control of a dominant minority, no longer confined to a limited territory, but deliberately going out of bounds to seize raw materials and enslave helpless men, to exercise control and exact tribute. This new culture was dedicated not just to the enhancement of life, but to the expansion of collective power. By perfecting new instruments of coercion, the rulers of this society had, by the 3rd millennium BC, organized industrial and military power on a scale that was never to be surpassed until our time. Erich Fromm goes on to say, "The thought that the male can create living beings by himself, with his mouth, through his word, or out of his spirit, is the most unnatural fantasy conceivable. It denies all experience, all reality, every natural condition. It disregards all the laws of nature in order to attain the one goal of presenting the male as the perfect being per se, who possesses the ability life appears to have denied him, the ability to give birth. The first act of creation is the birth of light. Light is always and everywhere a symbol of the male principle. Those who have checked out my astrotheology pages on the website will understand what he means by this. And we go into a description of how light is connected to the male and how light is also used as the weapon. Intellectual light, psychological light, and also physical light is used in this weaponry, this arsenal of weaponry against the feminine principle. And the feminine principle is not something in women only. It's a principle, a mode of thought, of consciousness of the male as well. We're not talking about male and female here only. We're talking about masculine and feminine, two polarities of even one individual. The Judeo-Christian paradigm comes in to subvert this, to control it, to mess it up. And the atrocity that they have created to create this inner scission, this inner schizophrenia. When we're in this kind of state, it leaves us open to any kind of power dynamics and manipulation. Don't we remember that in the Ten Commandments, in the Old Testament, the Jews are considered the chosen people? Well, they haven't built any pyramids or anything. They're not being honored by God because of their great genius. They're not being honored by God because of their great power inherently. They're being honored by Jehovah, by God, by the big Father, the big Daddy in the sky, because of one thing and one thing only, their obedience. They've been given a Decalogue, they've been given a Ten Commandments, and because they're so obedient to that, they are considered the chosen people. Leonard Shlain, in Alphabet versus a Goddess, says that monotheism does not mirror human society. Humans are first and foremost social animals, a deity who was alone, not by choice but because there were no other companions for him, was a concept without parallel in human society. The God of the Israelites did not have a wife, a son, a daughter, or a mother. So there you have it. All you need is the masculine principle. Samson, Solomon, David, Abraham, Jesus, the whole list goes on. It's the whole concept of the Sun King. He's alone, he creates by himself. And all are his obedient children. The Israelites are obedient. So today, in our crazy, war-torn world of stress and frustration, if we are obedient to Big Daddy, to Big Father, we will be the chosen ones. It works in ancient times, it works now. And these political leaders, as we saw in other presentations, other programs in this series, they know how to manipulate this. They know how to understand that they want something for giving us protection. And what they want is our obedience. And the more obedient we are, the more humble we are, the more selfless we are, the more likely we'll fall in line, then we will be sure to receive smiles from them. What is the attitude of the slave? What is the master-slave dynamic? It's very simple. The slave knows that the master can completely destroy him. Here's what you call your master, your leaders. These are people who can decimate you, take your very life away. So just in the act of your destruction, we say, don't kill me, I'll be your slave. So the slave and master relationship is born. But you see, the master always sees in the eyes of the servant and the slave the deep hatred that's there. And so eventually the master comes to hate himself because he knows that the whole dynamic, the whole relationship is built on violence and sadism. So not immediately, but over time, even the masters, the leaders, these sadists of the world, by being worshipped, but by being adored in hatred, not out of love, come to despise and hate themselves. Well, what do you think is going to happen in society and culture when these leaders need to vicariously process that hatred? In Weapons of Mass Deception, Behind the New World Order, we talk about this and how the sadist, if he can make his ambiance filled with violence and terror and war and upheaval and filled with enemies, then his own sadism is less apparent. And also another adjunct to that is that they're going to need to process this. It's vital for this inner toxicity to become processed. So the slave is responsible for the horrors that his master does. There's a connection here, a relationship. This is what we're left with when we understand how these cults have worked and what religion is really doing. Now, M. Hester Harding, one of the greatest psychologists the world has ever known, in her book Women's Mysteries says, the rise of masculine power and of patriarchal society probably started when man began to accumulate personal as over against communal a property and found that his personal strength and prowess could increase his personal possessions. Okay, so the muscular strength, the muscular power is mentioned here. This change in secular power coincided with the rise of the sun worship under a male priesthood. Sun worship was usually introduced and established by an edict of the military dictator, as happened in Babylon and Egypt, and probably other countries as well. Eric Newman, in his masterpiece, The Origin and Evolution of Consciousness, says, the correlation of consciousness with masculinity culminates in the development of science, as an attempt by the masculine spirit to emancipate itself from the power of the unconscious. We call this path ascent, because we experience consciousness and the world of light as being above us, and the unconscious and darkness as below, still under the spell of the primitive symbolism which associates the upright posture of the human figure with the development of the head and the rest of the higher centers of consciousness. So Newman, like many scholars in this, have thoroughly researched this and understand how the endogenic part of this works, how the interior thinking process, the apparatus of mind, of cognition, also is affected by this, and how up is heaven and down is hell, and how shadow and femininity and nature and children and animals, they're all a waste of time, completely without reason. They don't operate from reason, therefore they're lesser on the ontological scale of things. But God and man and heroes and bloodshed, that's all fine, that's all dandy, that's wonderful. Lawrence van der Post, the sociologist, in his Jung and the Story of Our Times, says that the history of civilization appears to be a sorry, one-sided history of domination by man. Almost invariably, the basic cultural pattern has been the work of man. Whole areas of history are darkened by the ignorance of man of the truth that they can create only through the feminine in their own natures, just as they can procreate in the world without the woman alone. Those familiar with my writings, especially on the tarot and the meanings of the different tarot cards, understand that I've gone into this also. That technology, science, is nothing but man's Frankensteinian, warped nightmare to try and mimic that all-important power that he doesn't have. Women give birth to children. Well, God gives birth to the human race, but somehow he's favored women with the power to give birth. Man doesn't have it. So, not immediately, but over time, compounded by the ages, man wants to rival the power, the procreative power of the female. His methodology of doing that is technology and science and cybernetics. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, in his book The Ultimate Canon of Knowledge, he says, "It needs no dissertation to elaborate and certify what the record of history reveals as to this portent obsession with the dour religious consciousness over the centuries. It has left its lamentable record in the tale of corruption, banality, superstition, bigotry, and general moral and mental blight that overspread the area of Christian Europe over the Middle Period, which has come to be known as the Dark Ages." David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, says, "Its name is progress, and the dream of progress continues to fuel global civilization's expansion everywhere, converting human beings into mechanized, self-obliterating puppets, and nature into dead statuary." William A. Kotke says in his Final Empire, "The civilized people believe they have an obligation to bring primitive and underdeveloped people up to their level. Civilization, which is about to self-destruct, thinks of itself as the superior culture that has answers for all the world's peoples. The addict truly is a person who is emotionally dependent on things, television, substances, personality routines, other people, mental ideologies, total immersion in some cause or work. If the object of dependency is moved, addicts will experience insecurity, discomfort, distress, the symptoms of withdrawal." Well, as we've been pointing out in other programs like Weapons of Mass Deception, these symptoms are being withdrawn. There's a death happening, the death of the middle class, and there's going to be withdrawal symptoms taking place in the very near future. The Maya predicted it, and it's on its way. And unless we get back to what is real, culturally, biologically, psychologically, there's not going to be much left to work with. Erich Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says, "These social and political changes were accomplished by a profound change in the role of women in society and of the mother figure in religion. No longer was the fertility of the soul the source of all life and creativity, but the intellect which produced new inventions, techniques, abstract thinking, and the state with its laws. No longer the womb, but the mind became the creative power, and thus, simultaneously, not women, but men dominated society." He goes on to say, it was Johann Jacob Bachofen, professor of Roman law at Basel, who presented the first major challenge to the naive beliefs that patriarchal society was a natural state of affairs and that man's superiority to women was a self-evident matter. But Aristotle, he said the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind. So here you have it, the greatest philosophers. Of course you're going to believe it. The greatest philosophers in the world are telling you it all, that the male is superior. We're in the 21st century now. maybe we can, finally refute this nonsense. Mark Nathan Cohen, in his book, The Health and Rise of Civilization, civilization, he said, has not been as successful in guaranteeing human well-being as we would like to believe, at least for most of our history. There is no evidence either from ethnographic accounts or archaeological excavations to suggest that rates of accidental trauma or interpersonal violence declined substantially with the adoption of more civilized forms and political organization. In fact, some evidence from archaeological sites and from historical sources suggests the opposite. Leonard Schlein points out that Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish scientist, he actually displaced Mother Earth from the center of the universe and replaced her with Father Sun. So again, you can see as these things start to happen down through the centuries, eventually the male psyche starts to warp reality and starts to compound the problem. John Zerzan, in his Elements of Refusal, says that when Descartes enunciated the principle that the fullest exploitation of matter to any use is the whole duty of man, our separation from nature was virtually complete, and the stage set for the coming of the Industrial Revolution. 350 years later, this spirit still lingers in the person of Jean Vorst, curator of France's Museum of Natural History, who pronounces that our species, because of intellect, can no longer recross a certain threshold of civilization and once again become part of the natural habitat. He further states, expressing perfectly the original and persevering imperialism of agriculture, that as the earth in its primitive state is not adopted for our expansion, man must shackle it to fulfill human destiny. And Sir Francis Bacon, in his Novo Organum, the new organism, says that consistently he used metaphors derived from the witch hunt and the torture chamber to describe how scientists should force nature to relinquish her secrets. Theodore Roszak, the American scholar, in his book Where the Wasteland Ends, says the astronautical image of man, and that it is nothing but the quintessence of urban industrial society's pursuit of the wholly controlled, wholly artificial environment, amounts to a spiritual revolution. This is man as he has never lived before. It draws the line through human history that almost assumes the dimensions of an evolutionary turning point. So it has been identified by Teilhard de Chardin, who has given us the concept of the noosphere, a level of existence that is to be permanently dominated by human intellect and planning, and which our species must now adapt if it is to fulfill its destiny. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, a study of Christian history discloses the portentous fact that the concept of the malignancy of matter coming into the movement of Hinduism through Zoroastrianism became an influence overwhelmingly dominating the theology and the ethic. It bred the monstrous cult of asceticism, whose driving motivation was the idea that the instincts of the flesh must be crushed down in the interests of the spirit. The tragic consequence of this staggering default of insight are incalculable, but in all conscience overwhelming to any intelligence that discerns it. It lay the Christian mind open to the obsession of a psychological influence that has been nothing less than devastating to sanity, inflicting upon the psyche a trauma that has produced morbidity and crushed to a degree the natural instincts for human happiness. But that's what this whole blitzkrieg on the human psyche was meant to do, to suppress the feminine, to alienate you from the earth, to think that God is up in the cloud somewhere and he's also wrathful. He's also an all-stern father figure who's judging your every move, to get you to be so schizoid, pathological, and existentially derempt that you wouldn't even be able to fashion your own destiny, your own thoughts. Erich Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says, the deep need of man not to feel lost and lonely in the world had, of course, been previously satisfied by the concept of a God who had created this world and was concerned with each and every creature. But for many of those for whom God was dethroned, the need for a godlike figure did not disappear. Some proclaimed a new God, evolution, and worshipped Darwin as his prophet. I added this because I want to make it stressed that just because you maybe have put aside one lie, like you don't believe in God, or say, for instance, you are not very religious, be aware that it's not just as simple as that. You may have other deities that you worship in exactly the same way, which also engender this pathogenic type of thinking pattern. Material thinking in general, the worship of money, of power, all does the same thing. Mark Brownstein says, where religion brought hate and called it the search for divine love, science brings death and calls it the quest for eternal life. I write that the expulsion from Eden meant the loss of the symbiotic connection with nature and the universal order, the scission between the microcosm and the microcosm, between psychic energy and physical energy. So it's poetic, I know, but we can think of that expulsion, that falling out of paradise, of Eden, as literally being disconnected from the earth. Ergo, the return to the earth and the return to the philosophy and the ordinances, to be more obedient to the laws and the inherent subtle ordinances and principles and laws of nature, of the earth, will signal the apple being put back on the tree of life, and also the return of sanity to the mind of man. Genesis 3 we read, because thou, and they're talking about Eve, not the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou wilt go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. In the lament of Sophia, from the ancient Gnostic book, the Pistis Sophia, it says, they have taken my light from me, and my power is dried up. I have forgotten my mystery, which heretofore I was wont to accomplish. I am become as a demon apart, who dwelleth in matter, and light is not in him. And we all know the idea of Lilith being banished and called a demoness. Lilith is nothing more than the healthy masculine aspect of the feminine. See, we accept the feminine, we accept Eve, do we not? We accept Mary, but it's this soft, pliable, recumbent, completely submissive principle. It's okay as a mother. It's okay as a whore, as a sinner. But to have the strong female and the strong feminine within, no, that's prohibited. That's taboo. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, he says, the influence of the book has done nothing to mitigate the virulence of the Western religion's bias against nature. Its glorification of the person and function in the history of the Son of God has in effect diverted all interest in the religious field away from man's relationship to nature. And Erich Fromm points out the consequences to this. Man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biological, non-adaptive, and non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and the danger to man's existence as a species. He says the most ample and horrifying documentation of seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. George P. Marsh, in his book The Earth as Modified by Human Action, says that but man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned into discords. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn again, he says, thinking which does not start from and continue in close relation to its foundations in the physical universe must lead to falsity. Erich Fromm says, in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, that's necrophilia, seems to develop in the new urban civilization. Michael Elner says that just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health. Lawyers destroy justice. Universities destroy knowledge. Governments destroy freedom. The major media destroys information. And religion destroys spirituality. Caitlin Matthews, the Celtic scholar, writes, our exile has not only been from the goddess, but also from nature. It is not surprising, considering that most Westerners live apart from their environment, protected by concrete roadways, consuming machine-processed foods and filled with media information to the detriment of the experience of their own senses. The seasons go unnoticed. We seldom touch the earth, or eat fresh food, or observe the world personally. The sacred is a forgotten dimension in our society, which we ignore at our peril. And David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, says something which has always affected me very profoundly. He says, we reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually, beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we are embedded that all we can do is navigate our way cautiously through a humanly designed, day-to-day substitute world of symbols. It's a world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel. And that is what is happening. That is what is occurring in the next 10 years. There is going to be what Nietzsche referred to as the return of the repressed. One, whether it's from worshipping false leaders or from not doing one's own spiritual inner work, or as these scholars are saying, whether it's from being cut off from nature or suppressing our feminine side, from all of these and many more reasons, there's a build-up of toxicity in the unconscious. And at some point, it's all needing to be processed. It's all going to come out. In the program we did called 2012, we looked at the fact that there's shadow work. Normally, a healthy individual will do what is called shadow work to process some of this dark content and may graduate spiritually as a result, become more adjusted to life. But there's times when simple shadow work is not enough, and other archetypes then take the lead. And those archetypes are, again, the Great Father, the all-powerful masculine archetype that leads its derelict children in the direction that it wants to go, which creates enemies and wants to destroy those enemies. And like in a sort of a Dr. Strangelove scenario, wants to drop atom bombs and cause all manner of havoc in order to expatiate and exorcise all of our own darkness and disturb psychic content. We may wonder if the overwhelming success of linear perspectives as the sole definition of visual reality isn't a symptom of some deeper condition seeking expression. And we might ask, why did some humans create and then rationalize with elaborate devices, ideologies and defenses, an unprecedented way of seeing the world based on distancing and detachment? Could it be that the linear perspective that infuses our vision from our glorification of intellectual distancing to our debunking of earlier realms of feeling and intuition, to our relentless lifting upward with skyscrapers and space shuttles, to the ultimate techno-utopian vision of downloading human knowledge into self-perpetuating computers to make embodied life obsolete, that such a perception is the result of some traumatic violation that happened in our human past? So again, the idea of trauma in the ancient past. Now, in this age, in this time, we're going to have to discover that if we realize that when we were close to nature, not close to the concrete and the steel, but when we were close to nature, when we lived amongst the shamans, when we had people who understood and took care of our psychological welfare as opposed to just our physical and intellectual welfare, that we went through rites and rituals that helped us to process all of this dark content. You see, our world today is void of any of these rituals. In fact, the only rituals that were provided are sinister ones, which only make the problem worse. Bradley A.T. Pask, in his book Rape, the book Rape and Ritual, says, depreciation and loathing of women, her body, and by extension the feminine, has been expressed repeatedly by our intellectual and psychological forefathers. In the Gospel of Thomas, St. Peter is meant to say, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. And Tertullian, the church father, patriarch, says, woman, you are the gateway of the devil, because of you the Son of God had to die. Well, that's very peculiar, isn't it? Because 5 minutes later, they're setting up in the Christian church the image of Virgin Mary, the sacred mother of Jesus. But then you turn to passages where Jesus is rebuking his mother, going, get thee behind me, I have no mother. Which is it? We've got so much contradiction here, we can't make up our minds. In Techniques of Persuasion, the scholar J.A.C. Brown writes that thus the tendency of religions to suppress the natural expressions of the sexual drive would seem to indicate a subconscious awareness of the fact that when normal outlets are allowed, sublimation into religious feeling is less likely to occur. One cannot help but notice the predominant role played by unmarried women in the Christian church, or the visible loss of enthusiasm for religious interests on the part of happily married women. Many have noticed the common use in devotional works of sexual symbolism and the tendency to express religious feeling in erotic imagery, even to the extent of describing what in another context would be taken as an account of sexual orgasm. Eric Newman says that for a while, the specific achievement of the male world lies in the development of the masculine consciousness and the rational mind. The female psyche is in far greater degree dependent on the productivity of the unconscious. So what is this scholar telling us? He's saying that the feminine, what we call the feminine principle, is aligned with or commensurate with the unconscious part of us, and that consciousness is the ego waking consciousness. But as scholars like and scientists like Bruce Lipton have pointed out, we are motivated entirely by the unconscious. Consciousness makes up only the smallest quotient of our psyche. So if we suppress the unconscious, not working with it, we're already in a schizoid state from that point on. Carl Jung, in Approaching the Unconscious, says that modern man does not understand how much his rationalism, quote-unquote, has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from superstition, or so he believes, but in the process, he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he is now paying the price for his breakup in a worldwide disorientation and disassociation. But that's all right. The pharmaceutical industry is run by the cult of Dionysus. They'll help. They've got answers. All you need is medication, pharmaceuticals, designer drugs. They'll take care of it. Now, Chellis Glendenning, in his book, My Name is Chellis and I'm Recovering from Western Civilization, says that Terry Kellogg emphasized the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them towards ourselves or other people or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behaviors because something unnatural has happened to them and they have become deranged. That's right, we are basically schizoid, we're deranged, and we are going to either project our sadism on others, or masochistically we introject the violence and the horror and the frustration and tensions that we feel. Loosely, they say that women tend to introject their self-hate or their world hate, and men tend to project it. This, of course, is because men are allowed to box each other and play competitive sports down through the centuries, so they're more likely to do it in an external way. It's considered less taboo. Whereas women have been prevented from that, so their tendency is to overeat and beat on their children and whatnot, and get into all other manner of dysfunctions. But the same root exists. It's the same origin to all these dysfunctions, regardless of whether it's introjected or projected. The problem is the same. Now, J.A.C. Brown, in his Techniques of Persuasion, lets us understand something about the nature of religion. He says that at a Calvinist revival meeting around the year 1800, in the meeting which followed in 1801, 20,000 men, women and children assembled outdoors and listened to the doctrine of hellfire and eternal damnation for the unrepentant. Almost immediately, excitement broke out. Some ran about shrieking in agony, or rolled on the ground for hours at a time. Others rushed into the surrounding forest crying, "Lost, lost," at the full pitch of their voices. Convulsive jerking movements began amongst many and spread like a contagion throughout the congregation and elsewhere. Groups of men and women went through the process known as treeing the devil, where they crawled around on all fours, barking and snarling at each other for long periods of time. Another phenomenon was the so-called frog hopping, when both men and women occupied themselves by frenziedly leapfrogging over each other. As might be expected, many in the final phases of the meeting went into trance or had visual hallucination and ended up by taking part in sexual excesses. He says in 18th century France, in a convent, One nun began to mew like a cat until presently the whole community was mewing day after day until stopped by the threats of the local militia, and the biting mania which spread through the convents of Germany, Holland, and Italy. In the latter case, powerful excitement manifested itself not only in biting, but in indecent exposure, tearing their hair out by the roots, and group howling and gnashing of teeth. He has a statement in his book from Martin Luther. Martin Luther writes, "When my heart is cold and I cannot pray as I should, I scourge myself with the thought of the impiety and ingratitude of my enemies, the Pope and his accomplices and vermin, so that my heart swells with righteousness and hatred, and I can say with warmth and vehemence, Holy be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And the hotter I grow, the more ardent do my prayers become." St. Augustine wrote, "Meanwhile my sins were being multiplied, and my concubine being torn from my side as a hindrance to my marriage. My heart which clave unto her was torn and wounded and bleeding. To thee be praise, glory to thee, fountain of mercies. I was becoming more miserable, and thou nearer." Because Augustine was thinking of getting married, and his mother told him that can't be, and he, of course, had to abstain. And here we read that he's getting closer to God as he's getting sadder and more miserable at his sexual repression. Now, the New England preacher John Edwards said that the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as we hold a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. Edwards was saying, as innocent as children seem to us, if they are out of Christ, they are not so in God's sight, but are young vipers, and are infinitely more hateful than vipers, and are in the most miserable condition. And sure enough, this kind of mania and repression coming out in a projected form as sexual degeneracy, criminality, and utter sadism is a well-known motif when we look into the pages of history, whether it's the atrocities of kings or sadist maniacs like Vlad the Impaler and Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or Gilles de Rais or Stalin, or modern maniacs. As Niccolo Machiavelli said, since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Well, that's right, everything is on its head now, everything is twisted round now, everything is inside out now. Sure. But where does it all originate? This is what we've been trying to demonstrate in this program. Leonard Slane in Sex, Time and Power says, when asked, most men will gallantly express their admiration for women in general and profess a profuse love for their mates in particular. Despite these touching personal testimonials, society is rife with misogyny and patriarchy. A cursory glance at the current newspapers or television news reveals a global society in which the majority of men disdain women. While some cultures are more egalitarian than others, men's actions suggest that they believe firmly in their superiority over women. Eric Newman, in his book On the Moon and Matriarchal Consciousness, says any development at any stage that strives towards patriarchal consciousness, towards the sun, looks on the moon spirit as the spirit of regression, as the terrible mother, as a witch. Leonard Slane, in his book The Alphabet versus the Goddess, the Babylonians elevated to the supreme position a god who had conquered and then mutilated a goddess. Patriarchy, he says, is the dominant theme in Hammurabi's code. Sons are commanded to obey their fathers, not their mothers. And sure enough, we have the Canaanite god Moloch, to whom the little children are sacrificed. Now, in Christianity, we've been seeing that we have a lot of pagan motifs. But one of the most beloved symbols that is in Christianity is, of course, that of the Christmas tree. But the Christmas tree comes out of the pagan past also. In those days, it was known as Yggdrasil, or the world tree, that had its roots in the earth and its branches in the heavens. It was the tree between heaven and earth, or the polar axis. And of course in religion, we always hear that the mystic or the prophet is near a tree. Lord Buddha, of course, in the famous Bodhi tree. We have Jesus in the baptism, and the medieval artists are showing the proximity of the tree of life, the fig tree and the olives. Lord Krishna always used to play his flute with the cowgirls under the tree. And Christianity, the cross originally had a serpent around it. It was the great tree. Moses sets up his brazen serpent, the tree of life and the serpent, a primordial Christian symbol. And of course the crucifix upon which Jesus is crossed was known as the tree of Golgotha. And in the tarot cards and all through mythology we see the image of the tree, the sacred tree. The tree of life is shown in the tarot cards behind the female principle. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, we also see in that book a great deal of mention of the elven tree and the tree of Gondor, the tree that has lost all its leaves and is dark and ruined while evil is abroad, but then that comes to life again as light and truth comes back into the world. In the Bible we have the tree of good and evil, or the tree of life, which contains the fruit of forbidden knowledge. We find that Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent by visitors to Egypt. In Egypt they had also the tree of the north and the tree of the south, or the two trees, and they were also known as the Jed pillars, because there was a priestarchy called the Jedi in Egypt. And the Jed pillar was the missing phallus of Osiris, but it really represented the Kundalini and the raising of the Kundalini energy. That comes down to us in more modern times as the caduceus of Hermes, the two opposing serpent forces that you see on the medical monopolies today. But the symbol goes back to Nuth, who was literally the tree of life. So yes, we have the tree of life motif, but it goes back to the old palmyriums of Egypt, and it goes further back so that the body of the female goddess is the tree of life. And that's where we get the word nuts. When you go and pick nuts, berries, nuts from the tree, that comes from Nuth, or Nut, the Egyptian goddess who was the tree of life. The ovums of her womb are the seeds that give birth to life. In Egypt specifically, but not only in Egypt, do you see the presence of the female goddess in proximity to the tree of life. Being the tree of life and being the keeper of the ovum and being the keeper of the mystery of being, here we see the whole story in an old papyrus where we have the old story of Adam and Eve. There's Adam, the Pharaoh, sitting on the chair in a recumbent and submissive position, being instructed in the mysteries by Virgo, the virgin, with the wheat sheaves on her head and the ovum in her hand. And that ovum, by the way, is the apple. In ancient times it was known that the apple from the forbidden tree of life, the apple was always known as the ovum of the female. And the little wriggling serpent that comes to tempt or to eat the apple or to bite into the apple was nothing more than the spermatozoon. The male sperm, which looks like a little wriggling snake or serpent, was in proximity to the ovum. So this is conception. But magically speaking, conception had other meanings. It had the meaning of the uniting of the masculine and feminine within the self. Androgyny, not on a genital level, but on a spiritual level. And the mystery of this process, the mystery of these rites and rituals was always in the keeping of the female, of the Eves. So in the Egyptian papyrus, we have the Adam and Eve story of Eve being the priestess initiator, offering the ovum to the male in the original Eucharist. Here again we see the interaction, that the Pharaoh, Adam the male, is a little apprehensive. There's the tree of life on the right, the fourfold tree of life, the tree of consciousness, the tree of the spine, and the tree of the cerebral spinal cortex. And the initiation. Now the lion chair that you see him sitting on is really the Panthera chair. The ancient priests used to wear the robes of the jaguar or the panther. In fact, the Semitic name for Jesus in the Talmud is Yeshua ben Panthera, because the panther skin was a symbol of the high priests. That was their logo or their emblem. Now, the tree of life represented man's intimate umbilical rapport with nature and the universal order. Its forbidden fruit refers to the sustenance by being non-differentiated from nature. What man considers his independent self, his independence, is merely hyper-alienation from himself and from the world. His ability to tolerate such an existential predicament has been increased by the conditioning of false theocracies which have created intricate surrogate pacifiers for the lost reality which he inwardly misses and craves. Man's attachment to these simulacras become the reason for further alienation. The spell is broken only for those whose inner voice is heard over the clamor of lies that besiege the brain and senses from all quarters. So your average serial killer, maniac, murderer type is the male who's secretly crying out for bonding with the feminine. But he's also got a love-hate relationship, a masculine, a sadomasochistic relationship with the feminine. He both desires it, but he also despises it. So the artists will paint the female picture. The female image is the most prevalent motif in art. So it can be adored, but it can also be slaughtered and murdered because the dichotomy has been set up. We have an ambivalent connection, not only to external females, where those who want to project this crime and violence, it comes out on external females, but the violence is already happening morally. The violence is already happening in an introjected way within the self to one's own feminine principle. And psychologists understand this. We can observe this in the ones around us. And we can also examine and notice all the reinforcements, all the ways in which culture and our parents and our peers and our priests and our politicians are emphasizing this and engendering this dichotomy within. And if we buy into it, we will be the sucker. We will be the ones who are totally have our own republic torn to shreds. The Son of God, as the sun above us in the heavens. Jordan Maxwell, in Ancient Belief System, says, if one also replaces the word son, S-O-N, with the word sun, S-U-N, wherever the former is found in the Bible, it will be discovered that every single verse fits the literal son and not a man. In fact, the verses make better sense. That's right. Every time you see the word Son of God or the word Jesus, just in your mind, put there the word S-U-N and think of the Son. And suddenly the Bible will come alive. And every passage not only fits, but makes better sense than if it was a biography. And that is how the mythographers who've painted the image of Jesus are showing you. The rays of the sun, the red cross of the equinox, standing on the clouds, haloed with the sun and the cross of the zodiac. The light of the world. Behold, he cometh with clouds, says Revelation 1. Yes, the sun does come with clouds. The Christians to this day in the churches raise their arms, and the old symbol of the Ka. Open any book on Egyptian mythology and look, and you'll see the gods raising their arms, and that is known as the Ka, the Ka. When you raise your arms like that to symbolize the soul. But just on the most primitive level, just observe the artwork. Just look at the imagery that is being shown to you. The Christ haloed with light. Our Father who art in heaven. We end our prayers with Amen, which literally meant the Son God. The words of Jesus in Revelation 22, I am the root and offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. Jordan Maxwell has pointed out many times that many of the patriarchs also correspond to the sun. Solomon, the name of Solomon is actually made up of 3 phonemes, 3 syllables that mean the name of the sun in the 3 ancient languages of the world. Sol is the Anglo-Saxon for sun, Om is the Hindu, and On is the Egyptian. Now the Egyptians had a city of light in the north called Heliopolis, that the Greeks call Heliopolis, city of the sun. But before the Greeks got there and changed the name, that city was called in Egypt On, O-N, the city of light. So when we turn a light on, when we say get on with it, get a move on, we're saying get light on it. On literally means the light. So Solomon is nothing but the sun. There's no biographical character. You're not going to find him. You're not going to dig him up. He doesn't exist. Saul Amon, like Jesus Christ, is the sun. And everything that you're reading about that Solomon is getting involved in is not a biography of a man, but a mythology of a sun. Same thing for Hercules and many of the other gods of the ancient world. Now, the name that is given to Jesus Christ at his birth is Emmanuel, but that is the same thing. That comes from Omonael, Om, On, and El. They don't even hide it. The Renaissance artists drew on this canon. Above the cross of Jesus, you have the sun and the moon, pagan motifs. The INRI that is above his head just represents in Latin, or in Hebrew by the way, the letters of the elements. I am, Rurik, Ibishah, and one other. These are the 4 names of the elements: fire, water, air, and earth. The beginning letters are INRI. Now Jesus is identified with the sun when you see him with a crown of thorns. The ancients understood that the sun had a crown of thorns, and that when you turn the thorns in, you make a crown. Kings would have their crowns. Jesus would have his crown of thorns. The symbolism is enough to put us onto the right track if we become sane and understand what we're seeing here. And again, the origin of a lot of it is Egypt, not just the 18th dynasty of Akhenaten, but many ages before that. Here we have Ra, Horus, the sun god, with a solar disk above his head. Now Mustafa Gadala has shown, the great Egyptian scholar, has shown that Jesus Christ, I mean, we've been saying all along in this show that he is not a historical or biographical character, but an interesting adjunct to this is that Mustafa Gadala, the Egyptian historian, has shown that there is an approximation of Jesus the Christ. He most clearly resembles the pharaonic dynasty from the 18th dynasty of Egypt. That is Akhenaten and his son, the Tutankhamun. If you read this man's magnificent work, you're going to see that even though 3,000 years elapsed, when the Hebrews in Rome were thinking about who to pattern their hero on, they thought of Simon Magus, yes. They thought of Judas Crestus, yes. But they also thought of Akhenaten, the old pharaoh, and his dynasty and the cult of the sun. The first monotheistic cult of Egypt is what they patterned their modern Jesus Christ on. Fascinating work. Now in the Vajra Sanyahi Samhita, we read that the Brahman, that's their god, Brahman, is the light of the sun. And in Hebrew, they took the Brahman and made it Abraham. Abraham, you just change the letter around, becomes the Brahman. And Brahman's consort was Saraswati. Well, wasn't Abraham's consort Sarah? But remember, they don't exist. Brahman is the sun. In the Atharva Veda, we read a passage that says, "The sun set in motion by the gods shines unsurpassed yonder. From it came the Brahma power, the supreme Brahman, all of the gods, and what makes them immortal." So the ancient Vedic texts also had personified deities like Krishna and Arjuna and Vishnu and Brahma, but they were under no doubt about it, that they were just personifications of the sun. Just analogies, just simulacras. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, we read that first was Brahman born in the east. From the horizon, the gracious one appears in splendor. He illumines the forms of this world, the deepest, the highest. He is the cradle of what is and what is not. Father of the luminaries, begetter of the treasure, he entered many-formed into the spaces of the air. They glorify him with hymns of praise, making the youth that is Brahman increased by Brahman. Brahman brought forth the gods, Brahman created the world. Nothing more than solar cult. In fact, in the Temple of Solomon, the old Jewish rabbis would wait until the spring equinox, the Passover, and then would go to the eastern door to blow their ram's horn. The ram's horn, of course, relates to Aries. And they go to the eastern door because they were worshipping the rising of the sun at the east. To this day, the Islamic people will bow towards the east. reverencing Mecca, but really reverencing the eastern horizon, the sunrise. The Manichaeans, a 3rd century Christian sect, we have a statement from them. The Christ, or the Christ, is the glorious intelligence, which the Persians called Mithras. His residence is the sun. Now the word Christ means the anointed. Anointing was the ancient custom throughout the East by pouring aromatic oils on persons as a token of honor. It was also employed in consecrating the priest, prophets, and kinds, and the places and instruments appointed for worship. That's the New American Encyclopedia, talking about the Christ. In ancient Palestine tradition, it would seem kings, political and military chiefs, village heads, and in fact any claimants to high office were anointed, and thence called the anointed ones. Some, after anointing, then became called the Lord. Very applicable to anyone who held office in the ancient world. The pharaohs were always anointed. Today you can go to the east and see the lingam of Shiva being anointed with holy oil by the women, and also anointed with milk. Tony Bushby says, Origen, Epiphanes, and Julius the emperor all clearly reveal that the John the Baptist, Judas, and Jesus' cousin was the Christ figure, but made no reference to Jesus himself attaining that status. Bishop Theodoret, writing in the 5th century, provided further confirmation that Jesus was not one of the Christ personalities, although many others of his time were. The son of Poseidon, the Medus, was called the Christ, and the priests of Apollo were known as the Christus. In fact, the word Christo and its derivations all appeared in every ancient religious system and showed the original Christo concept was believed to be the personal and invisible mediator and guide between God and everything spiritual in man. The Christ concept has been in ancient religious tradition continually suppressed by the Catholic Church through the centuries. Jordan Maxwell pointed out once that the company Crisco oil, why are they calling their product that? Because they know what we don't know, is that the old word Christ meant the anointing with oil. It's just as simple as that. Now, according to Bishop Epiphanes, the Christ is the spiritual self within each person. There finally the truth. Bishop Epiphanes has it down. We understand that the whole thing is an external carnival facsimile simulacra of man's inner religion, his own inner God, the temple within, as Jesus Christ was saying. Man is his own God, man is his own initiator and salvation. But you want to take that away from man and make it external. Now, the personality of Jesus Christ, as known to modern Christians, is based on several messianic rebel figures of the Holy Land, but particularly on Simon Magus, Judas the Galilean, Yeshua ben Panthera, none of whom had anything to do with literally being from God. The Semitic sect, known as the Essenes, anointed their leaders, who were known henceforth as the Star. The older nephew of Jesus, John the Baptist, and his twin brother Judas were anointed rulers of the Essenes. Their particular order was at Bethlehem, where he and they were reported to have been born. And the astrological references in this are very clear. But let us turn now to something more sane. What is the message and the myth and the man? We have this incredible story. What can really be gleaned from it? We've understood all its distortions. We've understood something about its origins. But can anything be gleaned from this? Or must the whole thing be cast aside? Are we meant to be atheists and skeptics and just learn how to debunk and rebut? Or perhaps can any fool do that? Perhaps it's easy to take away, but the art is in that we have to replace something of equal beauty or greater beauty and more pristine for that which we take away. That is an act of construction. Deconstruction is very important. In fact, it's an essential part of spiritual growth, to be able to deconstruct and let go and have a catabolic action to our development. But then, once we've done that, the time comes to salvage and to develop and to plant new seeds and to gain new wisdom. We've understood that the Bible is the story of the Son, S-U-N, and the Son of God, who personified it. For good or for bad, or both, the archetype and stereotype have long since become intimately fused. The greatest story ever told has empowered but also disempowered the populace, has enraptured but also perplexed the human mind. The story's ending is not especially happy, but it is not conspicuously sad either. It banishes futility just as easily as it can evoke it. We may question the historicity of Jesus, but we cannot question the relevance of the sun and its mythic and symbolic significance. It is not that Christ is the light, but that the light is the Christ. Horus and Set, Christ and Satan, are but the phenomena we call light and dark, expressing themselves physically and psychologically. It is the light that will be with us until the end of the world, and not a man. As we have seen, the Bible is a story about light, and not a man. It therefore constitutes a scientific as well as a religious epic. Now, Christians, for a variety of reasons we do not need to explore here, are likely to remain adamant in their belief in the physical Christ. And, as in the case of Robin Hood or Sherlock Holmes or Santa Claus, there is no reason why they should change their conviction and identification. The loss would be too great for any gain. And too many great truths have been based on this greatest of lies for it to be so roughly uprooted. Whether they realize it or not, the Christian is, even in his ignorance, closer to the ultimate truth than both the scientist, the cynic, or atheist. Because man is light, and light is man. The universe and the human are expressions of the same mystery. Man and world, or man and universe, are one thing, being viewed from two perspectives by the ego. The conviction of the Christian believer needs only to be widened to embrace truths which are equally as valid and enlightening to the heart and mind. The story of the man Christ ends at Calvary. A great man betrayed by a friend, arrested and dragged through the streets. He's mocked, he's cursed by society and condemned by the state. He is totally alone. The man who is so maligned receives our empathy. He doesn't have to be a god, he's a man, and he receives our empathy because he is us. His story exemplifies the life we all live. It is divine because it is so human. For me, personally, the entire story centers not around all the miracles and thunders and lightnings and all the other paraphernalia. It's at Gethsemane, of the healer of the world, the Son of God, the embodiment of truth, mercy, harmony, and light and love, watching his beloved, his friend, come up the garden path with an army of betrayers and deceivers and betray him with a gentle kiss. For me, that is the center of the myth. That is the message. And it's something that can visit all the teachers of light. In that is the poignancy. In that is the true story. In that is the poignancy. And it seems that so many in their movies and in their analysis seem to bypass that and favor so much of the other metaphysical, supernatural aspects. Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and your children, says Christ in Luke 23. Of course, because you are I. What I go through, you will go through. How can we forget that in the last days of the man's so-called existence, at the Last Supper, he's telling Peter, the man whom he would later give the keys to create what we know as the Catholic Church, the foundation, Petra, the rock upon which my church will stand. But Peter's busy denying him 3 times later on that same night. Judas, his own cousin, some of the scriptures are saying, for 30 pieces of silver, is betraying the Son of God, betraying his brother, betraying his enlightener. The scene at Calvary, the tragedy of a great man being hung between 2 thieves in front of his betrayers, is so inherently emotive and so patently human in tone that we often forget to understand how our emotional empathy occludes its greater existential meaning. The man whose life brings him to such a seemingly pathetic fate is not in pain at the end. He is neither regretful or alone. He is not suffering the needs no one and needs no one's help. He has arrived at this place because it is the inevitable end of the life he has hitherto been leading. So the mystery of this Christ is that if you want to live as an authentic man, if you want to live a moral way, if you want to be a mediator for the divine to the earth, you better realize you're going to have to deal with aloneness, loneliness, betrayal, and the rest of it. But the difference is the authentic man knows that ahead of time. The authentic man understands that the cup he will have to have put in front of him. But he's okay with it. He is not in lament. Our emotions should be, quite rightly, horrified by all of this. But he is walking the road that he is meant to walk. Now the ending is formidably tragic only for us, the witnesses, the spectators who, for a second, get to see an event which encapsulated the life and existential ardor of an authentic man. And I mean that in the full Germanic philosophical sense. It is we, not he, who balk at the futility and recoil at its insanity. He is present and is as accepting of his fate as were the Cathars of Montsegur, who walked on their own feet into the flames of the bonfires lit by their enemies, as those who rode with Crazy Horse on the plains of America. In that 1 minute of life before their death, such men were already living a deeper and greater life than most achieved during the long years allotted to them. When we read Christ saying in Luke 23, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," could we perhaps take the liberty and say that he really meant, "Father, forgive them, for they know not how they live"? When you're not living in an authentic way, you inherit the perdition of the worlds. And in my other work, I talk about the fact that, again, not only does Christ represent the Son, but he also represents the concept of the self-initiator and the fact that we have an inner zodiac, as Carl Jung said. As we all know, science began with the stars, and mankind discovered in them the dominance of the unconscious, the gods as well as the curious psychological qualities of the zodiac, a complete projected theory of human character. That's right, an inner zodiac. In divination and the goddess tradition, we go into that thoroughly, that the idea of Christ with 12 disciples is a whole other dimension to this story. The fact that we're an inner zodiac. We carry that template around with us. We are the walking temple of God. And as we return full circle to the 21st and 22nd century, to the time of solutions, we understand that through the divination arts, through astrology, through the tarot, these are our means of initiating ourselves back into our sovereignhood, back into our own Godhead. As the Egyptians knew, though, the day is coming, says Aesculapius, when the world will know nothing of the faith of the Egyptians. Our land will stand desolate, tombs and the dead will be its only witnesses. O Egypt, nothing but fables will tell of thy faith, and no posterity will believe them. How right he was. We would be in the time when all of these connections would be forgotten. The Egyptians talked of the inner zodiac, that man was his own light unto himself. Richard Tharnes, PhD, says that psychology textbooks of future generations will look back on the modern psychologists working without the aid of astrology as being like the medieval astronomers working without the aid of the telescope. And through the divination sciences, hopefully there will be a sea change and we'll understand the importance of working with these divination arts, because they were they not, the bequeathment from the stellar cult and the lunar cult of old. They're one of the most important oracles that we can use. Once they're used correctly, once they're used appropriately and with love and reverence, once we understand their innate laws and work with them properly and sanely, not just to bolster our egos and solve our little domestic disputes, but to understand them also as rites of passage, as barometers and as compass points to help us navigate the seas of time and the sea of karma and the sea of fate. Then we can reinitiate ourselves into what? Into what the Egyptians had long ago been teaching us, that man is his own priest and woman her own priestess. When tutored aright, when we understand what our fate and our destiny is, then we understand we need no intermediary. We don't need to look to any edifice, and we'll understand what horrors the world has suffered because we have actually done that. We've disassociated ourselves from our own power, and we've reaped the wind as a result. When man realizes that he was, as the humanists and the Renaissance masters understood, Adam Kadmon, the anthropos, the center of the universe, when he is in harmony, when he works on himself and balances his own republic, when his own city-state of intellect and emotions and biology, his inner house, his inner temple is in harmony, then perhaps at that point we can have, like the Druids of old and the Arthurian knights of old, we can have the perfect political state, the perfect unison socially But mystics, Gnostics, I would be amiss if I sat here and said that social cohesion and political harmony could ever come into being in this world at any time if the inner state of man was in chaos. This is simply not the case. In Acts 7, we read, "The Most High dwells not in temples made with hands." In 1 Corinthians, "You are the temple of God, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." In John 14, "The works I do, you can do, and greater." Well, why are we not being told this by the clergy who are meant to represent this Christ, this force? If he is telling his disciples, "What I can do, you can do also, and more." How come we then are kept on our knees in front of church and in front of state? How come we're not being instructed in our own power, our own independence, our own individuality? In this program, we hope to have shown you some of the reasons why, and also what to do about it. As Plato said, perhaps there is a pattern set up in the heavens for one who desires to see it, and having seen it, to find one in himself.